Hello, and welcome to this deep dive on the Sibyls. They were actual ancient priestesses who were seers. They were prophets of the future, diviners. They were very important in the ancient world, and their influence continued in Christianity right up to the Renaissance. So Angela and I typically talk about mythological figures or goddesses, but today we are actually talking about a job, which I think is so interesting, right? With the Sibyls, like it was a job they had
Yeah.
to do this in the ancient different ways. It evolved over time. So the Sibyls were women, usually older women, right? Who held positions of leadership and respect in the ancient Mediterranean. And so we're going to dive on in this history. This is like a weird herstory, right? Like it is, like say their name, the Sibyls, and really feel that kind of awakening in you of something that's very mysterious and is deeply woven through the history of the Western world for like the past 3,000 years. I think the earliest mentions of the Sibyls, I think it was, our friend Hesiod who mentioned them about the 8th century before the Common Era. So we know they kind of predate what we typically think of like as ancient Greek culture. So we have lots to cover. We're going to talk about the Sibyls. We're going to focus in on a few of them in particular, notably the Pythia at
Mm.
Delphi. It's a very important and probably the most widely known Sibyl. We're going to talk about these strange, apocalyptic, prophetic collection of texts known as the Sibylline Oracles, and how actual women have been treated when they clearly were acting as Sibyls. They were connecting to the archetype of the Sibyl, the feminine fortune seer in a very sacred kind of way. So, and then we'll bring it all the way up through modern times to how we are awakening the Sibylline aspects in ourselves here in 2022. So we've got lots to cover. So if you have your candle handy, you might want to join us in our little candle lighting ritual that we always do. And we start just by casting a counterclockwise circle to symbolize releasing and cleansing. And then a clockwise circle of protection and connecting, a sense of community, and so on. And then we always finish with some kind of invocation or a blessing. And I think we can't talk about the Sibyls without talking about one of their most favorite botanicals, which is the lowly bay leaf, that was so important to their practices, and that they wrote messages on these and burned them and did all kinds of things with them. So my offering to all of you are bay leaves as we get into the mysteries of the Sibyl. So Angela, I know you've been deeply connecting to like what it means to take on this role of Sibyl and the history of it. So before we launch the slideshow, what would you say like right now is really like sitting on you, like sitting at the top of the pile of what you've learned about the Sibyls?
Oh, that's such a question. I think that I would say the thing for me, like regardless, because Sibyls it's very much a romantic idea. It's become a very romantic role, right, in pop culture. But I think the role is still very much the same today in the sense that, whether you're sitting on a tripod or not, you have this huge responsibility to when you recognize the truth for whatever reason, like based on whatever constellations of information have revealed themselves to you, when you recognize it, there's suddenly a responsibility that you have to it, you know, to maybe conveying it. If you convey it, what is the purpose of conveying it? To whom do you convey it? What happens to that information once it's revealed, you know, like once it coalesces as truth inside you and then you release it? And this is so much of what the role of the Sibyls is to me. What happens to these things that come out of these women's mouths? You know, that's something that we focus a lot on, but also like how seriously they took it before that even happened, you know, which we'll obviously go into detail with when we start the slideshow.
I think that's so important. And the other thing that really is connected to that, that sticks with me, is this like fundamental need that we have to make sense of the world
Mm-hmm.
and to predict the future. That is, you know, that's hardwired in us.
Yeah.
And the role of intuition in that, which I think is really largely discredited, like in our modern society, is like, but we all do it.
Yeah.
And those of us who are really talented at it, you know, it is a gift, and it is a Sibylline kind of gift when we can see patterns and predict outcomes based on things that other people don't see. So I think there, you know, we all have some of this mystic inside of us, and how we connect to that. I think is a very individual experience, but I think we've all got a little Sibyl inside of us. So I think let's begin to explore these fascinating characters. So we positioned this photo of the excavated cave of the Sibyl of Cumae in Italy. So this was excavated, I think, in the early 20th century. So now you can go and visit it. But so I wanted to put this first to kind of really talk about the origins of the Sibyl as something much older than the Delphic Pythia and the Sibyls associated with early Christianity. You know, that the Sibyl as a figure, she went into the cave, like, so she returned to kind of like that womb-like structure, that underground, chthonic, more intuitive, we would say, experience. She wasn't like an above ground priestess. She was subterranean, which I think is so important in understanding like where the Sibyl kind of starts and where she ends up. This is where she starts. She starts in this cave under the ground. She is serving her community, both as a respected kind of elder in the community that serves like as part of the institution of the state, and also, you know, writing messages on individual bay leaves and serving as like a healer, like a community-based healer. That this role within the community was really old, and over time it became more institutionalized. But the woman healer who, you know, who can make sense of the world for others, in a mystical sense, that's really old, and, you know, dates back way before this cave to this idea of something being subterranean, and that wisdom and deeper meaning was associated with the feminine and associated with caves. I mean, I think like the caves in France that date back much, you know, many years before this, right? We have lots of examples of humans trying to make sense of the world from an underground place.
Yeah.
I did write a little bit about the Sibyls in Entering Hecate's Garden, my book on herbalism. And I even called that chapter Sibyllica in honor of the Sibyls, because I've always been enchanted by them and their position, like how they had unique power in the societies that they lived in. That so they were typically older women. They were allowed to own property. They were freed from like familial obligations, and so they had this kind of unique position in society, which I really connect to. And so I call the chapter on divination Sibyllica in their honor. So I'll read our invocation. This is just a little verse from the beginning of that chapter. So, Mistress, I call forth your Sibyls. Grant me their companionship now. Accept my gratitude for welcoming me into their fold. To the Sibyl of the flame, keeper of the keys, of visions of fire, I summon you now. To the Sibyl of the breath, keeper of the key of visions of air, I summon you now. To the Sibyl of the ground, keeper of the key of visions of earth, I summon you now. To the Sibyl of the depths, keeper of the key of visions of water, I summon you now. To the Sibyl of the cave, keeper of the key of visions of the underworld, I summon you now. To the Sibyl of the garden, keeper of the key of visions of the middle world, I summon you now. To the Sibyl of the starry road, keeper of the key of visions of the upper world, I summon you now. I claim my place among you. Show me the mysteries. Guide me to deeper understanding and teach me your ways. So in that verse, I was attempting to offer something that inspired us to see the Sibyls as deeply connected to the natural world and not disconnected, because one of the big challenges I think a lot of us have when we are exploring what our own spirituality is that we kind of have this hangover from an idea that the sacred, the divine God lives on high somewhere, very separate from us, and that to see the Sibyls very much of the earth, of the natural world, and to kind of do a bit of reclaiming their origins before they became associated with Christianity and so on, and even like organized religion in the Greeks and Romans world before Christianity, that they were like these deeply connected to the natural world um, guides, mystics who helped communities, helped individuals. So that's what I was attempting to do with that verse, is reposition the Sibyl right here as a very earthly, deeply connected creature. And that is my current set of Claromantic bay leaves that have the sacred seven principles on them. And it's one of my favorite ways to practice uh, divination, is to work with a set of bay leaves that have certain key words that I'm focusing on. So the sacred seven principles, they're in Hecate's garden as well. And to make your own Claromantica set. So Claromantica refers to the casting of lots, and the casting of lots, different types of lots, was very central to how the Sibyls conveyed their messages. And I guess in modern terms, we would use tarot or oracle cards, or even like the runes to cast lots, but we still practice Claromantica. So the Sibyls were mantic, and that mantic just means they practice divination using like these kind of techniques. And before we jump in, and while we're still like in the Sibyl's cave under the ground, I wanted to pull out this quote from Plutarch's Moralia that roughly translated means the face on the moon is that of the Sibyl, because that situates like to the ancients, the Sibyl and her connection to the cave and the moon were deeply what we could see as like archetypally feminine, so intuitive, emotional, outside of like solar culture, so like the busy marketplace of the day, in the darkness. So in a modern sense, we might say this is like shadow healing work, and that there was something inherently like mysterious and alluring and appealing, but also a little bit intimidating, that she wasn't solar, and that there were like the Sibyl as a role, like as a job, was common in the ancient Mediterranean. So there are some, we have a lot, about 10 that there's a lot of history on, but as a job. So this is an example from The Secret History of Witches by Max Dashu, about a Sibyl in that was associated with Pasiphae. So it's also interesting that the Sibyls were actual humans who lived, and also literary and artistic characters that were written about in the different great myths that we study today. So much about the Sibyl is lunar. And here we wanted to lead with how the Sibyl kind of became in Christianity. So this is a section from the Sistine Chapel, and this is the Delphic Sibyl. There's other Sibyls on the Sistine Chapel ceiling and many other churches in Italy and Europe. So the Sibyls became part of Christian lore, and their role in it is really like it is a parable of how I think women who had more intuitive capabilities, like how the whole thing about the feminine in general became really pushed aside and seen as crazy. So I think it's important to kind of lead with understanding where she ended up in terms of the Sibyl. And we were talking about this earlier, Angela, and how even though the research says that it was widely known that these were older women, that almost all of the art depicting Sibyls is younger, nubile women. And you had some really interesting thoughts on that. Why do you think that might be?
So this has happened pretty much everywhere, a culture where you had wise women that were considered central to sort of the wealth of the culture are colonized. So it happened in the Philippines as well. You had the babaylan, who were the older women, and they were actually, trotted out by leaders along with the wealth of a community to show how, how civilized and how wealthy you were, like how many old women did you have. And when the Spanish took over and colonized the Philippines, one of the first things that they did was hire painters to depict these babaylan, these essentially Sibyls, as young, nubile, sexy, half-naked women, just sort of giving up their altars and their idols. And it's the same with the Greek Sibyls today, right? If you watch the movie 300, you've got this sort of like lithe girl who's maybe getting raped sometimes, like she doesn't totally know what's happening to her, like she's half naked. And I think it's a really effective way of sort of reminding a culture who's boss while withdrawing power from where power used to be. It's a really good way of telling women, particularly older women who are crowned by this knowledge, that in the end, they're really only bodies. And the place where they're the most important is, when they're young and nubile. So like, sort of the role and the context in which they would have been the most valuable gets recast as even that role, which requires wisdom. If it's a girl's role, you have to be young and sexy. That's the only way it ever made sense. And it's also a really good way of sort of creating, I don't know, like a culture in which women's knowledge is fractured, because so much of the Sibyllic path is what was understood to be the menstrual path, right? Like that's women's knowledge. It's a woman's role that gets passed from women to women. So what happens when that's cut at like, I don't know, 19 or 20? Like what can an older woman teach you if this is not considered a role for an older woman anymore? Like it really fractures a culture when you start depicting a role like this as, exclusively youthful. And it does bad things to us as well, like I don't know, like it teaches us to hurry. Like we should be like developing this wisdom and these skills quite young. Whereas, like in these times, like in Greece or in the Philippines, this was a really long path. This was something that you worked toward probably your whole life.
Right. It's like that instant kind of shamanism that we see a lot today, that, you're a shaman instantly. I don't know if you take a course or you read a book and you call yourself a shaman. And, in the cultures where what we call shamanism in the Western world, where that was part of the community, it was like the Sibylline path, or, the women that you talked about in the Philippines.
Yeah.
That this is something that took a lifetime to achieve. So we don't typically associate great wisdom, great mysticism with the young, and yet there's these images like that, it is a young woman that conveys all this knowledge, even though I think we know that young women are not likely to be great conveyors of wisdom and truth because they're younger and don't have the experience for filtering what information they might be receiving from like deeper sources. Like they
Yeah.
just don't have, how do you manage that? And I think it's
Life.
interesting that you raised 300, because like we still see this when the Sibyl characters or female seers or even female shamans, you might say, when they're portrayed in the media, often they are these young, nubile women who seem to be very psychologically unstable.
Yeah.
And so we still have that issue with the crone.
Mm-mm-mm.
Like even in Game of Thrones, Melisandre, like how she was a little bit older, but she was still very set. But her truth, it was like the worst part of Melisandre was when it became clear that she was old.
Yeah, that was quite scandalous. Like the sort of the public outcry of discovering that moment was really shocking to me, actually. Yeah, that's a good point.
And like whether you loved that character or hated her, she did have a lot of like Sibylline qualities to her
Yeah,
in
she
that
did.
kind of fictional sense, right? Like, and that she was actually like the crone or the hag. So I think like our deep-seated fear and dislike of the crone in society, that's all connected to the Sibyls and the evolution of the Sibyls, and where we've kind of ended up in our youth obsessed culture.
Yeah.
And also, how our culture kind of says, well, you can learn how to do this instantly. You don't need to do deep study. You don't need to reflect on like what was written in Apollo's temple in Delphi, which was to know yourself. Like the path of the Sibyl, the path of the mystic is to know yourself and to
Yeah.
make sense of your own journey. There is a retrospective aspect to the Sibyl because, like, she knows her history and her community's history in order to provide services, basically, divinatory services and healing services for them because she knows where she came from. I think that's so important as an invocation to go into this discussion is, know yourself.
Yeah, I love that. And this is also definitely not to knock young people who are on the specific type of path. That's definitely not what we're trying to do. I think it's just to say, the path is long, and it's not defined by whether or not you're kind of like an Instagram witch success by the time you're 25. Like that's not the metric for this. It's like becoming a Sibyl was something that took you years and years of study and practice. It's not only knowing yourself, it's also knowing your community, because your community is part of yourself. It's this knowledge that kind of keeps flowering around you, and it was something that people took really seriously. But of course, we'll talk more about that imminently. It's just to kind of push back against this whole like you can buy being a Sibyl and you can buy being really great at what you're doing. You can, in a sense that, I don't know, like you can get the right tools and you can learn to trust yourself and be more confident, but you also require that humility of there are some things that only time can teach, and both of those things are okay.
Definitely, because I think you share the same pet peeve is when people um, do kind of like poke fun at, like they call them baby witches,
Yeah, or like witch talk.
right? And
Yeah.
it's like, no, this is all part of like seeking to understand yourself. It's
Yeah.
just to say like that this takes time. It's a long journey. And like you said, humility and grace are such a part of the journey. And, not rushing this.
Yeah.
And it's not a product that you can buy. Like
Yeah.
no one course, no one book, no pack of cards. None of these things are going to make you a Sibyl, or we tend to call Sibyls today like psychics, right?
Mhm.
Psychic mediums or psychic witches, or in other circles they might call them a shaman. We don't use the word Sibyl very much anymore.
Yeah.
Um, so, like this is something that you cultivate inside of you over time. And it is of the cave. It is lunar because it's interior, like it comes from within you. Um, it's not something that can just be like plopped on your head like a cap. It takes time. So just go gently. And because I think a lot of times people they're really hard on themselves too. They're like, oh, why am I not better at this? And it's like, well, because it takes time to
Yeah.
get there. And there is no quick fix, in my opinion, like no matter what you might see on the internet, like that it's something that you work at. And like if you do use tools like the cards, the deeper you kind of work with them in little increments over time, the more you find that, like what you and I were talking about beforehand, like the need to predict the future kind of goes away because you
Mhm.
are aligned with it,
Yeah.
right? And I think that alignment is something for a lot of us that comes over time. And that alignment is very Sibylline because then you can access and make predictions and decisions because you are aligned to what the fates hold in store for you. You're not pushing back against it. So
Yeah.
let's get in with the Sibyls. So the earliest research of these female priestesses, we'll call them, for lack of a better word, comes from Dodona, which was a temple to Zeus, the ruins still exist, so you can still go and visit them. And I love this. So this is the earliest quote from Hesiod's Catalogue of Women. There is a land, Holopia, with much glebe and rich meadows, and rich in flocks and shambling kine. There dwell men who have many sheep and many oxen, and they are in number past telling, tribes of mortal men. And there upon its border is built a city, Dodona, and Zeus loved it, and appointed it to be his oracle, reverenced by men, and they, the doves, sometimes this is interpreted as black doves, and there's a whole kind of sidebar on black doves and mysticism, lived in the hollow of an oak. So typically Sibyls are associated with the bay tree, but here it's with oak. From them, men of earth carry away all kinds of prophecy. Whosoever fares to that spot and questions the deathless God and comes bringing gifts with good omens. So the earliest record is from this temple to Zeus. There are a lot of artifacts from the temple at Dodona. And one of the really interesting things that people used to do, so I talked about writing messages on bay leaves, but they also wrote messages on lead tablets. And if you go to ancientgreece.org and type in Dodona, you'll find a whole photo gallery of different examples of these ancient tablets. And what kind of struck me is that the same questions people were asking here, like almost 3,000 years ago, are the same questions we ask for the cards now. So like, does he love me? And this
Mhm.
one here, the one I chose, says, if I emigrate, will I succeed in my craft? So should I move for a job? Like
Classic.
it's classic, right? That we turn to divination because we want to make the right decision.
Yeah.
Um, so there is some, I said Dodona is the kind of the oldest known specific site where Sibyls were held of elevated stature. There are some ideas, some scholars think that this actually comes from Libya. And there is one telling of the Pythia story. We're going to spend a lot of time with the Pythia, um, where there was a Libyan goddess named Lamia, and that she was the first woman who chanted oracles. So the Libyan Sibyl is one that will turn up in different places in art and records as one of kind of the 10 main Sibyls from the ancient world. So I wanted to point that out. And also, we've already talked about how these figures were old women. And this is just another example from Strabo's geography. So another ancient text that talks about the Sibyls, talks about Dodona and so on. And, talks about like these are old women.
Hmm.
And the connection to Libya, the connection to Africa, and that the role of the Sibyl was something that was probably imported from Africa into Dodona and other regions of ancient Greece. So this is just some basic information on the Sibyl of Cumae, who is one that's really intrigued me. So she, in literature, she connected Aeneas on his underworld journey. And then there are these Sibylline books, which we're going to spend a fair amount of time, which are these prophetic apocalyptic. So apocalyptic in this sense means predictive or divinatory, that they're telling a story. And so there's these kind of sources, but we need, like I said, we're going to talk more about both of these things. So these are sources of information, and then there's records of actual Sibyls like doing their job. So those are the three sources. I also wanted to point out that in addition to this theory that the Sibyls originated from Libya and Africa, that the Sibyls over time like became Greek, Roman, and Hebrew. You know, that there is this kind of conflation where they cross into those three religions and those three societies. So they're very ubiquitous in the ancient Mediterranean, and they cross religions.
Yes.
So this is an example. I wanted to include a picture of the Libyan Sibyl. So this is from the floor of a church in Italy that has tiles on all of the 10 major Sibyls that we know about.
Yeah.
And also, like, I wanted to just read this passage from this Jewish text actually talking about the Sibyl. So there's a lot of Jewish scholarship around the Sibyl. So we kind of have multiple sources, right? We have the Greek writings on the Sibyls, we have the Roman writings about the Sibyls, and then this whole area of Jewish writings about the Sibyls. And that it is very like complex and confusing at times, that the Sibyls were in some ways venerated, but also seen as like, crazy, stoned. We're going to talk about that more. And there's another quote from Plutarch, the Sibyl with frenzied lips, uttering words mirthless, unembellished, unperfumed, yet reaches to 1,000 years with her voice through the god. That the Sibyl is not like, she's not this romanticized, like you said, Angela, to them, she was this older woman who was unfussy in her appearance, very crone-like, we would probably say today.
Yeah.
But that what she spoke reached through 1,000 years, or with 1,000 voices is another quote, that she spoke for all and she spoke to all.
To add to that, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. You add to it while I get a drink.
Okay, to add to that, in the particular case of the Pythia, because like this Heraclitus quote is a really good example of, like, we'll talk a lot about like the ethylene theory and all of that in a minute, like about the Pythia being stoned, but there's a lot of conversation about like the Sibyls sort of like babbling and being senseless and sort of drugged. But for example, there are tons of records of the kinds of fortunes or prophecies that the Pythia provided, not only for individual people but also for states. Sparta actually came to consult with the Pythia about its own development, as did Athens for the development of its own constitution. And in instances like this, the Pythia was extremely clear. So there was a moment in Sparta's existence where it was actually it was quite opulent and profitable. It was really interested in the arts, and when it came, like when the heads of Sparta came to the Pythia to see about its future, the Pythia said very clearly, love of money and nothing else will ruin Sparta. And this actually inspired the Spartan state to become the kind of like really pragmatic, militaristic and lean state that made Sparta famous. And ironically, it was because of that, like because they became so disciplined, like they even refused the use of gold and silver because of what she said. And it's because of this discipline that they ultimately became a lot more prosperous. And when they started reaching for empire, ultimately, like the gold and silver that became available to them as a result of this became Sparta's downfall. And this was also the true, like this was also the case when Athens was looking to design a constitution. Like Solon came to the Pythia, and the Pythia said something about, like, basically she made a comment about compromise. She said, sit in the middle of the ship, guiding straight the helmsman's task. Many of the Athenians will be your helpers. I think even now, like, it would be hard to make the argument that this is vague or could be read in multiple ways depending on the politics. Like that's a pretty easy thing to read, especially if you're a diplomat and you're looking to understand the best way to operate your city. And this was the basis upon which, Solon tried to design Athens' first constitution. So I don't know, all of this is just to say there's a lot that gets said about like the Sibyl, and she like babbled, and so many things she said didn't make sense, which opens all these questions about who was actually interpreting and conveying this wisdom. But actually, again, to return to the topic of who the Sibyl was and the type of person that was placed in this role, this was a person who'd gone through a few cycles of life already. And the advice was usually quite sound because it was, a state's role that was taken quite seriously.
I think that's interesting. And also, like when I was reading the chapter in this book on the Sibyls, what struck me is this kind of tone, like in, I guess, like Judaic interpretations of Sibylline oracles,
Yeah.
is that they're very negative, like they're doom and gloom. They're kind of apocalyptic in the way we think of apocalypse today.
Yeah.
And I think that's like connected to this idea that she's like this crazy woman uttering mostly nonsense, but when she does say something, it's about basically the book of Revelations kind of information, that it's,
Exactly.
but when
Yeah.
you look at the actual like his existing historical records, like you said, there's so much known about the oracle at Pythia that it's like, no, she was actually giving really good advice.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when we get into talking about the Sibylline oracles, like that's more doom and gloom and more of what you might think. But then it's also the bigger issue about who is transmitting the Sibyls'
Definitely.
messages over time and how that changes as Christianity starts to take hold, or even as the cult of Apollo takes over at
Yeah.
Pythia, right? Like who gets her information and then who conveys it, which also kind of reminds me of, just how when anyone is kind of transmitting deeper knowledge, like it reminds me of us talking about Cassandra earlier, like women not being believed. And it's
Yeah.
like the Sibyls needed like a handler, that in order to legitimize them as things become more what we would call like solar, um, that when her cave becomes less of like a refuge and more of like that's this weird place almost of exile where only the Sibyl goes, and it's not about the womb and all of that. It's so as this changes over time, I think it's really interesting just to remember like there are records of what the Pythia had to say. And we also have all those lead tablets, from example, at Dodona, about what people were asking
Yeah.
of the Sibyl, right?
Yeah.
So we see that these are really like practical things, and her advice was very practical a lot of the time.
Yeah. And there's also a lot, like, just to return to the doom and gloom thing, there's also a lot of evidence to suggest that her moral compass was really different from the moral compass of that time and a lot closer to the one that we have today. So for example, blood guilt was a really big deal in Greece. Like you killed somebody, you were fucked, like you were, this was a really big deal. Like the family had a right to you, basically. But the Pythia was she was one of the most potent voices in terms of making these sorts of like inner evaluations of guilt or innocence. So for example, if two men had killed someone and one ran off and one was really trying to make this effort to, face justice and make amends, for her, this latter man was somebody who was purified, and this it had no precedent in that time. Or also the idea of shedding a slave's blood. It didn't matter who you were, you had to undergo rites of purification because you were a murderer. Like this was a Pythia idea, this basic idea of human rights that gets passed down in later religions, like the more romantic pictures of Christianity, for example. These were quite often Pythia ideas.
So we're starting to see like how the Sibyls influence like permeates today.
Yeah.
And how they were sometimes like counterculture, to what was the prevailing kind of norm of the time, and almost like advancing a more just society in certain cases. So I wanted to briefly return to the fictional Sibyl.
Yes.
And Virgil's Sibyl, and this whole business about the Sibyl being associated with the underworld and that interior journey. So, in a lot of the Greek kind of heroic tales, that, and this is one example, and then of course, like there's like the Odyssey and so on. There's other examples like that the hero has to go to the underworld. He has to go in the cave to become whole. Like part of his journey is this return to what would have been understood as like feminine, intuitive, otherworldly, the dead, the ancestors, all of this business. Like that was always a stop along the way in these fictional accounts of the hero's journey. And with the Sibyl of Cumae, she is very enigmatic. That she was like this. This is from a paper by Emily Gowers that's talking about the many mouths of the Sibyl. So we saw an earlier quote that refers to like she speaks of 1,000 years, but it was also like she speaks of 1,000 mouths. That she is like connected to what, like in Jungian terms, we would call like the collective unconscious. Because when I hear like many mouths and 1,000, like it's like to me that's collective unconscious. Like she's connecting to something much deeper. And then there's this way that she becomes Christian, and then this whole idea of being a clairvoyant. So all of this business about this deeper wisdom that is intuitive and perhaps comes from beyond us, whether it's the collective unconscious or if you believe in spirits or gods or whatever, that this is associated with like that inward journey into the cave. And also our beloved Hecate, of course, has to make an appearance for Aeneas in association with this visitation to the Sibyl of Cumae. So it's interesting, like in this story, Aeneas can't get into the cave. The Sibyl's like, no, you're not coming in. I'm going to show you some things. It's like, I'm going to put up my phone and show you this video, would be the modern version of this, but you actually can't see the thing. And what is revealed to him is this, like everything about the underworld, including Hecate, which I think like I tend to adopt like a James Hillman perspective on Hecate, that she's like this spirit that represents the soul, like that she is the deeper. So when she appears in a myth, it is about like what is super kind of lunar, super interior, and that she's about the soul and spaces in between, and that which like can't be quantified and always has to be maintained as mysterious. So it makes sense to me that if the Sibyl is revealing the mysteries to you, that part of what you would see would be Hecate as some kind of emblem of your own soul, like of the deeper soul of the world. So I think that's really interesting. And then there's that famous quote that the Sibyl speaks to Aeneas: if I had 100 tongues and 100 mouths and an iron voice, I could not take in every form of crime or go through every punishment by name. And so it's that idea that the Sibyls like knew the extent of humanity, right? They knew all of our sins and our crimes and everything, because they reigned over or had access to the entrance to the underworld where they could see all of humanity, which I think is part of developing that wisdom, right? Like where you have that kind of bittersweetness. Like I just finished reading Susan Cain's new book, Bittersweet, And so
Mm.
to me, the Sibyls are kind of like this ultimate bittersweet character. So they have this power of divination, um, and prophecy and seeing the greater scheme of things. And that's not a romantic place to be, because you see the bittersweetness of humanity, right? You see the good and the bad, and you can't mention all of our crimes, and you can also not mention all of the beautiful, loving things we do. But she has access to all of that. So I find that passage really touching. It really kind of touches upon, like, oh yeah, you can talk to the Sibyl, but you can't enter into her realm.
Yeah. Yeah, and this relationship between the Sibyl and the underworld is also quite old. So, for example, the Melicide, the bee maidens who would prophesy, using bees, they would often retire into darkness, a state called incubation. And even in the early cults of Apollo, it was understood that the sun god came from the underworld and returned to the underworld, and that was where he got his wisdom from. There was a very deep and close relationship at that time, like in a much earlier time, between Apollo and Persephone. And it was understood that if you wanted to search for and acquire knowledge, then like Apollo, you had to incubate in the darkness. There's a lot of evidence to demonstrate that over time, in the same way that like the role of the Sibyl becomes very solar because of Apollo, like so much happens such that like even Apollo's own role gets a lot more solar than it used to be. It used to be quite a lot more balanced, especially where these matters of wisdom were concerned.
So the whole juxtaposition of the arrival of the sun god, which is first, well, one of the first ones would be Apollo when he became
Mm.
solarized,
Yeah.
and then also, of course, the birth of Jesus Christ, and that as the ultimate like son of God, right? So that there's
Yeah.
this whole shift, great kind of like tectonic shift that happens in the ancient Mediterranean in how they kind of experience their own lives,
Mm.
and the divine. And I think, in Virgil's telling of Aeneas's story, the fact that everything in the underworld is really kind of horrific, and to be avoided, so there's that element of like, yes, you need to go, to kind of face your inner demons, face your inner shadow, but that this is like the underworld is a really bad place. So so in this version of the story, it's starting to really take on that spirit, that Hecate as a spirit of the soul, the spirit of the deeper world, in that kind of James Hillman way, is something to be avoided. And like the Sibyl's got to be responsible for that, because not us. I
Yeah.
mean, you see this in other versions, like in the Odyssey and so on, when the hero goes and sees all the miseries of the underworld, reminding them that the solar world is the better way to be.
Mm-mm-mm.
We're still continuing with that paper. I think I've covered just about everything I talked about there.
Yeah. I just love these images though. These images are incredible.
Like, so they're all from that church,
Yeah.
which I
The
don't
one in Siena.
remember where. Do you remember where it was now?
Siena. Yeah.
Um,
Siena, Italy.
and Siena, you're right. So they have like the 10 major Sibyls that are known, and I just thought they were so interesting, so they're from the late medieval period, and of course how they were like brought into the spirit of the times, and they're just so fascinating.
Mm.
Um, so because I just really enjoy these ancient evocations of spirits, in works like the Aeneid and the Odyssey. Do you want to read this? I read the last one. You read this one.
Okay. The streaming blood, a lamb to Helen night, the sable wool without a streak of white. Aeneas offers, and by fate's decree, a barren heifer, Proserpine, to thee. With holocausts he Pluto's altar fills, 7 brawny bulls with his own hand he kills. Then on the broiling entrails oil he pours, which, ointed thus, the raging flame devours. Late the nocturnal sacrifice begun, nor ended till the next returning sun. Then earth began to bellow, trees to dance, and howling dogs in glimmering light advance. Ere Hecate came, far hence be souls profane. The Sibyl cried, and from the grove abstain. Now, Trojan, take the way thy fates afford, assume thy courage and unsheathe thy sword. She said and passed along the gloomy space. The prince pursued her steps with equal pace. Oh, this is a really good translation.
It is a good I looked at different ones.
Yeah.
And this is the Aeneid by translated by John Dryden, which is fairly new, but I really like this translation. We could probably geek out about Greek hexameters and whether or not translators need to follow them, but I really like this. It's very evocative,
Yeah.
without being kind of so constricted, and it's also not too like loosey goosey.
Yeah.
That's a
Yeah.
technical term for describe. I think it walks a nice, like a nice line, while still being very like true to the original source material, but
Yeah.
but it still has that kind of like visceral emotionality to it that really comes through.
Yeah, I like this a lot. I'm reading a like a Dante's Divine Trilogy, like a new translation right now, and it's kind of loosey goosey. So like, so I really appreciate this. Yeah.
um, and just to loop back to this idea that Hecate is the spirit of the underworld and the deeper self and so on, and the Sibyl connected with her, and then the hero is told, "Go on your way, like take off your sword, fight the solar battle. We'll just stay here in the lunar underworld realm in our cave."
Yeah.
So there's that kind of, he has to visit that energy, but then he has to move on from it. But it's not really his energy to dwell in too much.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway,
But that's
anytime.
like an ongoing theme of so many of our conversations, right? Like you can't stay in the underworld too long.
No, you can't. From the
Mm-mm.
grove abstain, which is a great thing to yell, like if your pet is like getting into something they shouldn't be, just like, from the
Like,
grove abstain.
abstain!
Oh, the next time the deer are eating my vegetable garden, I'm going to yell that at them.
From the grove abstain.
So just because the Pythia at the Temple of Apollo in Delphi, because there's so much data that remains, we've already been talking about her a lot. I think maybe one note that we haven't made super clear is that this was a role held over hundreds of years by many women.
Yes. It was not
That
the same woman for hundreds
it
of years.
wasn't the same. This isn't like Old Testament Moses business.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
she lived your average lifespan, and then a new one would emerge, and take over the role of the Pythia. So like it literally, so the Pythia is a type of Sibyl associated with Delphi. Have we talked about? I don't think we talked about the origin story of the whole business with Apollo, and how the Pythia, the Sibyls were already there doing their thing, and then
yeah.
Apollo came to town. Do you want to tell that story, because that's really interesting, especially since we did Medusa last month, right? Like this issue of women and snakes, the Dracana energy.
Yeah, this is true. So I don't have the details of the story exactly. Correct me if I'm wrong. So
Okay.
Apollo's looking for a place to build a temple. He's always looking for a place to build a temple. Like the entire Apollo's whole thing in the Homeric hymns is he's looking for a place to build a temple, and nobody wants him around. Like all of the land is just trying to get him to leave. Um, so he arrives at Pytho. He really likes it there, and like there's already an oracular sort of universe that's set up here that's coming from the python, like a huge sort of like a beastmaster snake, like it's more than a snake. It's kind of like a greater spiritual parent snake. And Apollo goes to war with it, because of course he does. He fights with everything. And he kills the snake, and he appropriates the power of prophecy. This is in fact how he gets the power of prophecy, from this dead female snake in its cave. And then he appropriates the Pythia, the women who gather the prophecies of the snake, for himself. And this is how he comes to have the Pythia.
So it was like colonization.
He colonized, yeah, the Pythia. Yeah.
And I like how you said, like in the Homeric hymns, it's like literally nobody wants Apollo. So it's
Yeah.
like literally like we're fine. We're more of a lunar culture, you could say, right? Doing our
Yeah.
own thing here. And Apollo, the son of God, comes to town with all of his. I always imagine Apollo has like the actual. I know he's not Helios, but I always think like Apollo has like the actual like a halo.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Like
know
a
that.
really righteous halo,
Yeah,
right?
like
Because
that
like,
righteous hubris halo.
yeah.
And at
Like
first
there's a
nobody
lake.
wants him, but then eventually
He will,
um,
yeah.
he wins. He kills the snake.
Yeah, yeah. But it's also like it's classic Apollo. Like there's a lake who doesn't want him around and he leaves and then he realized the lake lied to him. So he spitefully buries the lake. Like he's just doing this all the time. Like even his mother, when she was pregnant with him, she couldn't land anywhere because of a curse related to Hera. But eventually she cut a deal with with an island where Apollo was born, and the island made her swear the most significant like swears of the gods, because the island was like, we've heard about your son, we're not sure about him, we don't want him to be born here because we think that like when he sees that this island is just sticks and rocks, he'll just like crush us, like it's basically like your unborn son is a total jerk, you have to swear he's going to be like super nice if we let you land here and give birth. So this is just like what Apollo is like. Yeah.
And I think you raise a good point here. I mean, I think we're doing Artemis in a few months,
Mhm.
um, but
Oh
just the
yeah.
contrast between Artemis and Apollo. Like there's
Yeah.
Olympic Artemis, which we all know, like Diana, she's got deer, she's running around in a mini skirt, doing who knows what in the woods. It's pretty cool.
Mhm.
Um, and then there's kind of like the older version of Artemis that we'll be talking more about when we do that. But there is this thing between Artemis and Apollo and the difference in who they come to represent, like
Yeah.
as the Olympians become, like the pantheon that the Greeks identify with the most, like as the Titans and other gods kind of fall asunder, like in how those famous twins, um, and their temples, and how temples of Artemis, I mean, temples of Artemis would certainly have Sibyls in certain like similar capacities, but
Sure.
because like the sun god becomes so venerated and elevated, this is what we focus on, like knowing about now. I mean, we do, and we know a lot about. We There is a lot of data existing from temples to Artemis, but still, it's like those secret histories of the women, right? Like this is still a secret history where it's like the Temple of Apollo, and although there's a lot known about the Temple of Artemis, like we don't talk about it, which is really,
Yeah.
so part of like our work here revealing these secret histories of the feminine is, it's part of like broadening that out. Like there's a lot of data out there, it's suppressed, like we don't talk about it.
Yeah. This is true.
And once again, in this beautiful, I love this painting, and actually someone we know, Angela, has this as a bronze statue.
Who? Is it
Someone,
someone
someone in
who has
Covina. Yeah, someone in Covina. They had it set up on an altar, and I was like, I didn't even know that existed as a bronze statue.
fantastic? I love that.
But she's young, again, very nubile, very young, but she's holding her bay leaves, and there's
Hmm.
bay leaves on the ground as well, and she's sitting on that crack. I
Over
think you've
that
got a
crack.
slide on what that crack business was all about, right?
Yes, I do.
Okay, let's
I
talk
do.
about the crack business. We haven't talked about, like you did talk about, like when Apollo came in, the whole thing with killed the snake, the Dracana, the female snake, and but what was going on before Apollo got there, which is really interesting to me, which is
Yes.
what I would kind of say is Gaia, although there's other earlier ways to say this, that there is like the indigenous Aegean earth goddess, and was deeply associated with the dragon or the snake, the sacred snake. And, and how much, like, what a tipping point this whole business with Apollo coming to the Pythia was, in terms of like the understanding of the great mother and the sacred feminine and so on. And this is another great, more modern painting of the Pythia. And I like how she is kind of in a cloud of her smoke, which I think you're going to talk a little bit about.
Yeah.
And she's still young there, though she looks less young. Like she could be 50. if she had good like hair dye.
Yeah, she has good bone structure.
And
Yeah.
she's got, I think she's got some bay leaves on her and so on. If she's got good bone structure. We're not sure if that was part of the job requirement.
People just have it.
I think this passage from The Secret History of Witches by Dashu, it just kind of reiterates some of the things we've already said. Let's see what else, if there's any. Oh, in the hymn to Apollo, which we haven't talked too much about, there's another story. So before Apollo takes over Delphi, he comes to Telphusa and decides to build an oracular temple to himself there. The nymph of the sacred spring resists, again, just reinforcing what Angela, like the story about the lakes and so on, attempting to dissuade the interloper with flattering words. She convinces him that he should go to Mount Parnassus, where the steep terrain would prevent horses and mules from trampling the ground. And so he goes on to Delphi. So you can see this. Nobody wanted Apollo, but Apollo would find a way.
Trying to get him to go.
Right?
Yeah.
Which reminds me of the kind of Christian idea. My grandmother had this painting of Jesus knocking at a door in her kitchen.
Okay.
So she had like two kitchens, like a summer kitchen and a winter kitchen. And so over the wood stove in her summer kitchen was this really old painting of Jesus knocking at the door. And so there was always this kind of idea that my grandmother kind of conveyed that, like, no matter how much of a sinner you were, Jesus would just stay knocking on the door of your heart forever. And I feel like that's a very sun god thing. Like Apollo is just like, no, I'm just gonna keep knocking until you acquiesce to my ways and stop your foolishness. So I don't know why that. I see a lot of connections between Apollo and like the Roman kind of son of God figure whose name honestly escapes me right now. Do you remember his name?
No.
Completely just flew out of my head. And Jesus, like they're all like shades of the same character with different names.
Yeah, definitely. And he also, like, he is persistent. Even after he goes back to Delphi, he returns to Telphusa. And that's when he punishes the spring for lying to him. Like, he just, you can't send him away long. Like, that's what he did with Cassandra.
Right.
So,
and here is Apollo and the serpent doing their thing. So this is from about 5 centuries before the Common Era. So it's one of the earliest surviving images of the Pythia, of what happened at Delphi.
Yeah.
So, and then this is more modern. This is from the 19th century, but this is a very, I would say, widely known painting of the Pythia and what went on. So it's very romantic, right? It's like high romanticism here in how she's on her tripod. So the Pythia always was on a tripod. And that, she's divining, she's doing her messages, and she's surrounded by like the men who will communicate what she said and kind of transmit it to the world. And then there is that famous egg, and that egg is supposed to be one of the markers that this is like the center of the world, that Delphi was the center of the world. But from what I've learned, there were many places that were the center of the world.
Yeah, but I did read in a William Broad's book on the Oracle, that by the 6th century BCE, like the Oracle like of Delphi had become so important that it became like a matter of state. Like the Delphians were not allowed to be the only ones to manage her. Like it just became a political issue. So they designed something called the Amphictyony, which was a league comprised of 24 representatives from 12 different Greek cities to just kind of like be around her, because she came to be considered a huge aspect of Greek national identity. And everybody just kind of like wanted a hand in making sure that, I don't know, like they were involved in what she was doing. So this is like, I don't know, like when I look at this picture, I think of that as well. Like, it's not like necessarily that she needed a bunch of men to like help her interpret things. It's also that things got really political, like just like when an agency gets a big account and suddenly you can't make a decision without 30 people being in the room. Yeah, like it was just it became a lot more important to have like lots of decision makers there because she became part of Greek identity, not because she couldn't make proper decisions, but because nobody felt comfortable not having their own city involved.
Right. Everybody wanted a piece of her,
Yeah,
and everyone wanted to like, be protective of her. So like she became like a corporation basically.
exactly.
Like a
Yeah.
state corporation that had to have like a board of directors and all of those things because she was so important.
Yeah,
It's a beautiful work of art though, isn't it?
it is. I really like it.
So we've kind of briefly touched upon the idea of, the terrible sorceress goddesses, that ecstasy. I mean, we talked about Semele, Dionysus' mother, and this idea of like fear of women's sacred frenzy, and how like with the Sibyl, because she was associated with this at least partially,
Hmm.
um, that there's this like fear of women's ability to connect to this. And I thought this paper, which is actually about um, Sibyllic aspects in The Diviners by Margaret Lawrence and Lady Oracle, who I honestly forget who wrote that. But the whole point of this really interesting article is that Sibyls are alive and well in literature today, modern literature, even if they're not called that. And she refers to this great research by Catherine Clement, who's written a lot from an academic perspective about this ancient Sibyls. And she raises a few points I just want to like put on our table, that the history of the sorceress or the Sibyl or whoever, that feminine mystical creature often ends in confinement or death, like it doesn't end well. And then she also makes this really interesting point. I was raised in a religion where speaking in tongues was part of the practice. So she raises this point that women more frequently than men speak in tongues,
Hmm.
which certainly is something that we could see in some of the accounts of the Sibyl, that she was speaking in tongues. Like we could call it nonsense or barbarous words or whatever, but that in a modern sense, in a lot of churches today, like in evangelical Christian churches, this speaking in tongues, uttering words that are perhaps a more ancient language or a different language, like it's still a practice. And I can remember this very vividly. My great aunt, my beloved great aunt, Val, often spoke in tongues during services. And I do believe like she was one of the few people in the relatively small congregation that did this. But in my recollection, like it was like women did this a lot more than men. So there is
Yeah.
that Sibylline thread, even in the evangelical church today. And then, someone else. And as I recall correctly, so women would speak in tongues and sometimes they would also give the translation into
Yes.
English. But a
Yeah.
lot of times it would be a man, from my recollection of growing up in this environment, that the woman would do the speaking in tongues and then a man would offer the translation into English.
Fascinating.
So like this has carried on. And evangelical churches do this to this day, like speaking in tongues as part of it. So the Sibyl as an archetype is alive and well in different places in our society. I mean, we're going to conclude by talking about like the fall of religion in Western society, but I thought that was really interesting, this whole idea of like speaking in tongues. Well, of course, the Sibyl is still present.
Fascinating.
Yes.
Wait, Cindy, I have to
Okay.
pee.
Okay.
Be back. You didn't turn off the recording.
Oh, I paused screen sharing instead of the recording. Oh, we apologize, everyone who's watching the unedited version of this while Angela and I took a pee break. I
It
hit
was
the
this.
wrong button. I've been sick. I was bitten by a brown recluse spider. I know. I'm going to use that for an excuse as long as I.
Uses excuses. It did cure you of inflammation, though. That's pretty cool.
Okay. Why did it do that? Is the screen sharing back on?
Screen sharing has never left.
It says your screen sharing is paused.
I don't know. I can still see it. I'm on. I still see the Sibylla Delphica slide.
Well, Zoom. Zoom has had its way with us.
Yeah. It was a thing that was going to happen.
It was a thing, right? Okay.
Eventually, it was just going to happen. Yeah. Okay.
Oh, because if. Okay, just a second.
I love this little detail, though, that you found.
Yeah, I'm going to pause it for a minute.
Okay.
So we're back for the second half of our talk on the Sibyls. So I think we'll just get right back into where we were, which is we were deep in the Pythia. And you did some really amazing research on like what the structure actually looked like. And
Yeah.
also in what trance-inducing aids the Pythia may have used. So I think that's where we left off.
Yes.
Okay. So you've got a lot on this slide. Why don't you just walk us through everything you've got for us here?
Sure. So to start with, in the upper right-hand corner, like if any of you ever wants to go through this on your own, there's quite a short and lovely paper where I extracted all of this information. But if you ever want more, there's also William Broad's, the Oracle, which, we have a slide about, in our next slide, actually. So you can also look that up. That's a great resource. I think it's only like $3 on Kindle. It's a very old book, so that's nice. So basically, so figure 1 is kind of like it's what it says, the only surviving depiction of the Pythia from the time when the oracle was active. So you can actually kind of have a look at what that appeared to be. She's sitting on her tripod, and, she's looking into her scrying materials. The second figure is of where the oracle was actually located. So you can see it's located on these series of faults that form an X just under Mount Parnassus. And this is because this was only recently discovered, and William Broad goes into a lot of the detail in his Oracle book. So there are a lot of a lot of philosophers and a lot of writers of this time who talked about the sort of like the pneuma, right, that was sort of rising around her. And there was a lot of debate about was this like a fake pneuma, like a spiritual pneuma? What was this? And William Broad actually, he worked with geologists, I believe, who only recently, I think in the 2000s or maybe the late 90s, figured out what that was. So the oracle was actually built over an earthquake fault. And there's this story about how the fault was found. At the time, well before the oracle existed, there was a place where goat herders would come, along the mountains to take their goats, and the goats started going crazy. They behaved in these really strange ways. And then maybe half an hour later, when they were away from that area, they became normal again. And so they realized there was something there. And that was where they built, the first oracle. It's not known how long the space was used, but basically this space where the oracle was built is designed over an earthquake fault. And because of the particular sort of the rocks that were smashed together there, it was excreting ethylene. And ethylene has a lot of really particular behaviors. So in the lower left-hand slide, you can see it's from this study that I quoted in the upper right, descriptions of the Pythia at Delphi, from her mantic sessions, and also descriptions of mild anesthesia with ethylene. And you can see how they sort of align, like rapid onset of trance state, full effects in 30 seconds to 2 minutes. You have this sort of like calm response entering the aditon. The aditon was where the particular room where the oracle was. Like, I think it literally means something like do not enter. Like only the oracle can enter that space. And it's because like in the space just beneath her, like this is also a particularity of the temple. The temple did not have a marble flooring, it was clay flooring. So you had direct access to the ground, in essence. Like she was the only one allowed inside to access the ethylene effects. You have this sort of like pleasant state of being, no anxiety or asphyxiation. Like you can basically just sort of like access this higher part of yourself. You're still conscious, you're still lucid. And then, you can still stay seated. You can still respond to questions, which is really important, obviously. Your pattern of speech is a little bit altered because you're in an altered state, but also some minutes after your exposure, you can quite quickly become normal again, like 5 to 15 minutes after, exposure to ethylene. Like once you've come away from it, you're in your normal state again. In the last chapter of his book, William Broad actually tests this. He kind of hotboxes himself with ethylene to see what happens to him. And he talks about the sort of altered state that he enters into where, he just sort of kind of sees the code and he has a lot more clarity. So a lot of the these images that I show are images of how they specifically designed the temple around this ethylene fault. And another one of the interesting things that he talks about is that over hundreds of years, the ethylene deposits, they come to be less and less reliable. So the Greeks actually designed sort of piping systems to sort of capture and take advantage of the ethylene when it was most present. Another thing that we'll talk about in the next slide is also the oracle was only operational in for 9 months, so in the winter time. She was not operational. And this also aligns with when the water deposits in that region would be frozen. And that would effectively stop the ethylene from rising. So there was no access to that during those times when the oracle was not active. Another effect of ethylene is that even if you're lucid at the time that you're on the ethylene, you might have amnesia of whatever it was you said while under the influence. So a lot of these sorts of mystic effects of not being aware of what is happening can also be attributed to ethylene. But I don't know, I do want to qualify this, but let's qualify it in the next slide. I just think that this is really interesting to show how they sort of built a structure around the ethylene deposits. And one of the reasons why it was so hard to find, according to William Broad, why it was under debate for so long, is that ethylene doesn't leave a trace. Once the earthquake fault stops secreting that, it's harder, you can't really find it. You have to actually know what you're looking for, which was why it was really critical for a geologist to kind of stumble across this information on site.
That's really interesting. And in this image is so interesting. She, of course, is holding her bay leaves in what may be like a scrying bowl, like a divinatory bowl with water or some kind of liquid in it for receiving the messages. And then she has almost like this symbol beside her that kind of reminds me of the wheel or the strophalos, that labyrinth figure that's associated with Hecate. So, and she, of course, is on her tripod doing her work. So there's a lot even in that surviving depiction of the Pythia. Okay, so let's get deeper into how this ethylene might have influenced her ability to get into trance.
Yes. So I've just put in the screenshot from William Broad's book because as we were talking about earlier, there's a lot of talk about how the oracle was just high. And he spends most of this chapter talking about reductionism, how people just sort of try to reduce her huge impact of over hundreds of years into like, the fact that she was high, and maybe it was other people who were, like sort of like helping her interpret things. And, like she was totally like, she was not in a lucid state. But actually the case that he makes here is that ethylene is just like one aspect of a larger whole. Like for any of you who have ever been on like any particular kind of psychedelic, like I don't know, like LSD or psilocybin, you probably recognize that like a lot of people worry about that, like, oh, how can you be reliable in that context? But quite often what people report in that case is that they feel incredible lucidity, and they can solve problems, and they can think about life in a really different and specific kind of way. And so this is also part of what he's talking about, like this, like he says something like the chemical stimulus in no way explained the oracle's cultural and religious power, her role as a font of knowledge, her liberation of hundreds of slaves, her encouragement of personal morality, which was like not a thing in that time, her influence in helping the Greeks invent themselves, or by extension, whether she really had psychic powers, even if her prognostications were judged to have no basis in literal foreknowledge. It provides no explanation for how she reflected the underlying currents of ancient Greek society and how her utterances stood for ages as monuments of wisdom. So to kind of write this off as like, well, she was stoned, she was manic, like you can kind of hear vestiges of like, that's mostly just patriarchy talking, and also a lot of like a scientific reductionism, right? Like saying, oh, there was like very clearly a reason. And what I love about William Broad's analysis, like he's a wonderful writer, is the case he makes that the fact that there was a drug involved does not change anything about what the oracle represented or the importance of the role that she took on. And in fact, he goes into a lot of detail in his book for how she prepared for that role and, like what that role actually reflected in society. So, to kind of reduce it to, oh, she was just crazy. It's just kind of a repetition of like what we like to say and what Christianity liked to say about oracles specifically when they decided that oracles were not a good thing, which we'll also go into later, obviously.
But it's interesting, like because we see that so often. Like this reminds me of that book, the I think it's called the Immortality Code. It's
Mhm.
like trying to reduce all of these experiences to something that is like based in empirical science, and saying like, oh, well, she was just stoned, so it has no veracity. It's like, well, but all of human experience and wisdom says that when we are in a like a transpersonal state, that we do have a lot of clarity and
Yeah.
wisdom.
Yeah.
It's so it's just really interesting. And then it gets to, I think, like the return of like people going like on ayahuasca vacations, like us seeking this kind of experience that can't be kind of rationalized. It had, it's very different than like, oh, well, there was ethylene there, so she was stoned, and so therefore she was nuts, and case closed.
Yeah.
So I'm really glad that Broad does such a good job explaining that, that was just part of what she did.
Yeah, exactly. And so, okay, so like I try to summarize here a lot of the things that he goes into a lot of chapters to explain. So to start with, he dispels the idea of her being young, right? Like he says, like maybe there was precedent that she was young once, but there's a story about how there used to be this convention maybe that it was a very young virgin because it was somebody who had to be dedicated to Apollo. And what happened was somebody came from Thessaly. Like Thessaly was where all like, he clarifies, like it's where all the big bads come from. um, and he fell in love with the girl while she was talking, if you can call it that. And then he takes her away and he violates her. And after that, like Delphi actually has a conversation and they're like, this is not okay. We can't use such young girls anymore. And allegedly, this is one of the ways that it becomes an older woman. They're like, it has to be someone over 50. And the way that she will dress, like, you know, she'll dress conservatively to sort of like hark back to the time when it was a young virgin. So this, and over time as well, like what happens is like over the hundreds of years of like, you know, these much older women holding this role and making it a lot more of like a status and class situation, like as the role becomes more politically important, they also start selecting for more important women, in fact. And as previously mentioned, there were a lot of like serious ablutions and purifications conducted to put her in this state, like, you know, to return to the topic of like psychedelics or hallucinogens, like they're really sort of like what you put into them and the intent that you bring to them, right? So she, in the times that she was working, she couldn't participate in family life. She couldn't have sex. She had to leave her family for a while. Like she had her own apartment in the middle of Delphi. And she also went through a whole series of purification rites before she could sit on the tripod, as well as the people who worked with her, you know? So there's, you know, we talked about how we do this for ritual, for example. There was a lot of mental and physical preparation for what was to come. And, you know, so she was already in the correct state, in addition to having lived whole cycles of life when the ethylene kind of came and hit her. And lastly, as mentioned, and this is just kind of like a fun detail, she only practiced 9 months in the year for Apollo. And then in the winter, she didn't practice at all. Like you could still come and like have your fortunes read, like using sort of like these smaller sort of like fortune reading tools that were present. But over that time that she was not active, Dionysus took over Delphi. This was actually one of the only places in the ancient world where Apollo and Dionysus cohabited. And it was also understood by some that they were functionally the same god. So, you know, you had to have that like rigidity and, you know, like that sort of setting of rules and that sort of solar energy constantly balanced, you know, with the wildness and the lunar, obviously represented by a man because Greek was patriarchy by this time. But yeah, like this idea of balance was also really critical. You had to have your rigidity and then you had to have your wildness in the winter associated with darkness.
And it's interesting too, because I think when we did the class on Sibyllae, we talked about, you know, how a case could be made for Dionysus, that Dionysus pronouns would be they, them.
Yes.
And so it's interesting. So when Apollo and the Pythia rest, you know, what we might see today is like more non-binary Dionysus comes to town, and, you know, and that there's that different season,
Yes.
which from a psychological perspective is, you know, it's such a great, I think, starting point to contemplate like our own seasons and our own
Yes.
association with the solar, lunar, and gender, right? Like in being one or the other or both and all those things. So there's a lot to kind of digest from that. And do you remember she only did this, like, was it the seventh day? You had to come and see her on the seventh day?
Yeah, there was something like this. Like he goes into a lot of detail about like when you could come and how people
Yep.
had to draw lots. Yeah, it was something like this. It was like there was a special day that you had to come see her. Yeah, yeah, there was a special day.
She also had a good, like, terms of work contract.
She did. Like her job was really, really cush. And he also explains how, like, in a universe where there was not a lot of upward mobility for women, especially as they got older, this was like a good job.
Yeah.
This was like such a good job to have.
She had
Yeah.
3 months off the year and she only worked like the seventh day of the month. It's like, this is
Yeah.
good.
Yeah, it's pretty sweet.
What else do we have here? I think we've been talking about a lot about the Pythia.
Oh yeah. Oh, the types of questions that were posed to her. Yeah. So we talked about this a little bit. Like, so not only political questions, but also like those deep personal questions that people still ask. Yeah.
And more about that whole idea, like was she just babbling gibberish, and then men put it into those beautiful, deep, and meaningful hexameters that we're so familiar with from all of the Greek epics, and that the male priest had to do with that. There's a lot to really uncover about like why all these things, Hesiod and everybody, why they use hexameters, and it's really interesting to think about like how the structure of the language was a tool for communicating. Maybe
Yeah.
someday we'll do a deep dive into like why hexameters and why that's so important in all of this, like these Greek literary sources. And just to reaffirm, I think this just comes from like the Encyclopedia Britannica entry on the Pythia, because I like to kind of look also at like what's out there that's widely available. So it just reinforces a lot of the research you've done, and that she is the source of the prophecies. It wasn't the men who were just kind of capitalizing on her kind of cachet as this mystical figure, and then they were just saying whatever the hell they wanted. That it really was her parlaying this information, and they were passing it around. They were the mediators, passing the information around. And this is one of my favorite images of the Pythia and her Delphic tripod, where she is doing her business and she's got lots of snakes around her and so on, doing that.
It almost
Okay.
looks like a cauldron. Yeah.
Right? It is, yes. Cauldron, tripod. It's interesting because cauldrons have 3 legs too, right?
Yeah, that's true.
So now we're going to fast forward a little bit and start talking about the Sibylline Oracles and what happens to the Sibyl kind of like after Delphi, and as the Sibyl becomes part of the Roman Empire, as she crosses the sea, and what happens and how there is this complicated interplay between the Greek and Roman Sibylline traditions and Jewish and Christian writers of the time. And that there is a kind of like a further appropriation. So we focused on the Pythia as an example of like the sun god appropriation of the Sibyls. And then that this further gets appropriated where her prophecies become really capitalized upon by Jewish and Christian writers as well. And that a whole bunch of, I said I needed to find more synonyms and stop saying weirdness, but it's weird what starts to happen now, for lack of a better word. So this is a great academic article called "I Will Speak with My Whole Person in Ecstasy: Instrumentality and Independence in the Sibylline Oracles" by Olivia Stewart. So that is, we've been featuring a lot of Christianized images of the Sibyls. So maybe that gave you kind of like a preface that all of this art depicted like by Michelangelo and others, like that the Sibyls become entrenched in early Christianity, and that really persists through the medieval period. So there's another famous painting of her giving her oracles.
Yeah. And there's so many stories of like women saints and their ecstasies. This is very much a part of the culture of early Christianity.
Yes. So there is this idea, like in the Sibylline Oracles, so these are a collection of prophecies written over centuries by Jews and Christians in Greek hexameters and voiced by the figure of the Sibyl. So there is a lot of discussion from what I've been able to uncover, and not being someone who has a PhD in this area, but from what I've been able to uncover, that the Sibylline Oracles most likely weren't written by a Sibyl. Maybe they started out from the Pythia or the Sibyl of Cumae, that they were utterances that they had shared. But then these Jewish and Christian writers, and also Greeks and Romans, got a hold of what they said and started, maybe because of her popularity, like the popularity of these women, to twist it into like an agenda. It became propaganda.
Yeah.
So we go from, if you think of like the early, like the Sibyls of Dodona, for example, and the pre-Apollo Pythia, where they were giving this kind of information, they become part of the state, so they become institutionalized, kind of like when the Greek Empire was at its height. And then as the Roman Empire expands and as Christianity starts to be adopted by the Romans, that her role, like, is so influential that these Sibylline prophecies come out. They're very apocalyptic, very doom and gloom, and they supposedly tell the story that the Sibyl of Cumae, I think it's that one, that she accurately predicted the birth of Jesus Christ,
Hmm.
and the whole kind of nativity story, and then basically a lot that sounds like the Book of Revelations. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of discussion about like the origins or the provenance. Did they actually come from the Sibyl of Cumae, or were this just like male writers because of the use of the hexameters, of course? Like, was this just them saying that she said this in order to get uptick in society, to get some traction for these Christian ideas?
Yeah.
It's
This is
really
also,
fascinating.
yeah, this it is. And it's also like a strange colonization strategy. Like the Enlightenment writers, like there was, like during the colonization of the Americas, for example, there was a lot of conversation between Amerindians and Europeans at that time. Like they published tons of tracts with these huge philosophical conversations that Amerindian chieftains were having with Europeans. And over time, like as Enlightenment writers, like, initially Enlightenment writers were like arguing about the really interesting philosophical points that were being raised. But over time, they started appropriating Amerindian voices in fiction in order to pass their own particular Enlightenment agendas. And so this is also something that we do over and over. We did this as well with Merlin and Taliesin, these guys that had a really specific role, and then over hundreds and hundreds of years, they come to symbolize something really different, and they develop a tradition sort of develops around them about that's more about like the tradition itself and what people want to make the tradition into than about anything they actually were or represented or did. So this is also, I mean, regardless of who wrote the Sibylline Oracles, probably it was like a political tool, as you say. This is something that, we've done many times throughout human history, was like take something that became more important as a symbol and then speak using it as a mouthpiece for political reasons.
Definitely, that's very well said. The Sibyls became a mouthpiece through the oracles. So this is, you can, like the book that Angela referenced, you can get a copy of the existing, the remaining Sibylline Oracles on Kindle for a couple of dollars if you're interested in this. And again, it's a lot of Christian doom and gloom, prophecy, so on. Like it's not, it's interesting, what it was written in Greek, of course, but it's not the same. It's not the what would have been communicated like by the Pythia, or
Yeah.
even probably by the Sibyl of Cumae, who this is sometimes attributed to, but other Sibyls as well. So I think it's really interesting just to talk about like that there are so many oracles existing from those times, and that really important authors of the day like Pausanias, Plutarch, Livy, and others, that they referenced them, whether they were writing in terms of like nonfiction reference, we would call it today, or like in the case of the Aeneid and so on, in a fictional sense, that these oracles were really super widespread. And over time, they, these fragments from different sources and also other writers like became known as the Sibylline Oracles, and that this was a tool of Christianity, which is really, it's like we've come a long way, from the Gaia pre-Apollo Pythia to this female oracle almost in a Sophia role, like there's the font of divine wisdom. But at the same time, I mean, we need to keep in mind what was happening as society became more and more patriarchal, that the actual like continued presence of the Sibyls, like as doing that work, became more and more problematic as the centuries kind of, because we're into the Common Era now in the early days of Christianity. So we've covered over 1,000 years of history. And so like the actual existence of Sibyls, they were not so fond of, but referring to these Sibylline oracles, they were very fond of. And there's some stories about the Sibyl of Cumae and burning the oracles to protect her legacy. And then a lot of them supposedly got burned twice when Rome burned down. So there's all this kind of like lore around the oracles, the Sibylline oracles themselves as a text. And just to make it clear, so when we talk about the Sibylline oracles, we're talking about this collection of existing fragments that supposedly there used to be a lot more, but they've gotten burned, and there's all this kind of almost cursed energy around them.
Yeah.
And Sibyllic oracles would just be a term to talk about any Sibyls, like any Sibyl giving an oracle. So I found that confusing when I was first learning about this. I was like, Sibylline oracles. I was like, no, that's a specific book. And it's often compared to the Chaldean oracles, which would have been like emerging at a similar time, like in the early days of the Common Era. And
Yeah.
that, of course, the two of them are often kind of put together. And
Yeah.
that in that, the Chaldean oracles, that is where Hecate is reimagined as like the soul of the world, and kind of you can see that kind of lineage, like there's always this connection between like Hecate in the depths and prophecy, even in the as the world becomes more and more solar, that there's this need to like massage these spirits, because the spirits themselves are very hard to control, even if like the mortals who may have had these roles in society to like bring life to the archetype in society, even if they could physically be stopped. I mean, in this case, we're talking about women, but that the archetype would still kind of weave its way into society and needed to be dealt with in some way.
Yeah.
Um, so here's another image of those Sibyls. I'm just so fascinated by the fact that these Sibyls are in all these Christian churches, and a lot of people who have gone through these churches for hundreds of years probably don't even realize who they are.
Yeah.
That they became kind of like mouthpieces for the church in describing like Christianity, Jesus, and so on, the book of Revelations kind of business, all of this stuff, and that they're still there. So even though they were being like manhandled and what they said was really controlled, they still had a presence, which I just find that really fascinating.
Yeah, but I wonder, like, sort of spoiling our way into the next couple of slides here, I wonder to what degree that presence, as it became more divine and associated with Christianity, also became more fictional, as like, sort of like real instances of oracle became outlawed,
Right, and that's certainly what happens. Like, so now we've marched from the Roman Empire, and now we're into kind of like medieval Europe, just to
Yeah.
give you a bit of a timeline.
We're always just meandering through thousands of years.
Right? It's like we're going to start with Hesiod and get to 2022. Thank you, Hesiod, for existing and giving us information about life 3,000 years ago.
Exactly.
Okay, so there are many women during the medieval period who were not called Sibyls, but certainly like putting our, like looking back at them, we can see they were carrying on the lineage of the Sibyls, and that archetype of the Sibyl was alive in them. So we just picked one. There are many others. Joan of Arc would be one a lot of people would know. St. Teresa, like there's a lot that people might know. I picked Hildegard of Bingen. I just really think she's awesome.
She's so good. Yeah. She just produced so much stuff.
right? So much stuff. We should do a whole episode sometime on her because she's just like,
Yeah.
she has all the things. So she, like, so as these like historical figures of the Sibyl have been like elevated almost to the point like with angels or something being painted on the ceilings of all these and floors of all these churches,
Mm.
they become less connected, like you said, to actual women doing the work of the Sibyl. And that so as these characters become like mythic, um, actual women like Hildegard here, who were doing this sort of thing, being visionary, being a healer, being learned, because there's evidence that the ancient Sibyls like knew a lot about society. As they knew a lot about how the world worked. So very learned. These things for women became like more and more difficult, and were outlawed. Like Hildegard had to transmit her messages through a man. So again, that's very like Sibyllic, right? It's like, well, you get the message as the woman. You are the one who speaks in the tongues, like in the church, but the man has to convey it to
Make it
society.
official. Yeah.
And it's becoming like outlawed, like during the medieval period. It's not just kind of looked on as like being outside of acceptable Christianity. It's actually becoming outlawed. And, Hildegard as a nun, like she couldn't officially do this. By this time, only men were basically allowed to be official mystics. So she had to hide a lot of this. And like I said, there's dozens of, they went on to become saints, fortunately, but there's dozens of Christian uh, women mystics from the medieval period and later who had to really hide their power and find safe ways to communicate the prophecies that they were receiving.
Yeah.
So now we're kind of moving into the Renaissance. And so this is a painting of the Libyan Sibyl who has magically become white as snow by this point. um, which again, it gets to that whole idea of like making Jesus white, of
Yeah.
making, like making everything white. And so Christianity, so even the Sibyls became white, Jesus is white, Mary is white, everybody's white all of a sudden in these paintings and in depictions, and really almost like removing Christianity even more from its origins.
Mm-mm-mm.
Like so this time she's not on a ceiling and she's not doing anything super special. She's just reading some books, which is interesting. And the most fascinating thing about this painting, why I put it in the slideshow, is that this actually hangs today in the picture gallery at Buckingham Palace.
Mm.
So the Sibyl's presence, like as she evolved into this historical figure that helped to form Christianity, um, and just how disconnected that's become from any person, be it a woman or otherwise, who is like doing the job of a Sibyl.
Yeah.
So like you would never find a modern mystic hanging out in Buckingham Palace, but a painting of one as a historical figure important for the founding of Christianity who has been whitewashed. So
Yeah.
it's that whole thing, right?
Because this is true. This is such a political move, right? Like by the time this picture is painted, like I think the witch hunts are already like they're starting to foment, like particularly in relation to Oracle. She's white, like clearly there's a sense that she's noble. Her like whatever Sibyllic magic that she has is mostly related to the fact that she's reading. She's a student essentially. So there's very much this message about like what a proper Sibyl would be like and how that's mostly associated with being noble and learned, actually. Like that's the most appropriate context for this now.
Which and the Latin inscription translates to "Hail, chaste Sion, much suffering young woman, Samian Sibyl." So it's this idea that she's young, she's chaste, she's learned, um,
Yeah.
that kind of all like, so the fact that, I mean, we know from documentaries like The Burning Times and Margaret Adler's, lots of work that tells us, the women who were serving as these kind of mystical healers in communities were none of these things.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? They weren't learned. They couldn't read books. That wasn't something that most women could do back then, or most men either.
Yeah.
So there's this whole like cleaning, like the Sibyl really got scrubbed by this point in time. And I think that is in some way to kind of separate this idea of the Sibyl's role in the formation of Christianity from like actual Sibyls. And we'll see more on that.
Yeah.
This, now we have to get to Shakespeare. I don't know. Can you and I do a recording of our deep dives without getting into Shakespeare? You
I
would
know.
think we were both English literature students, which we were not.
He just gets everywhere.
He just like he represents like it's like a tipping point in a
Yeah.
lot of things, like he raised like the witch hunts were going on, the King James Bible coming out. Like he is just a really accessible, like we can talk about this in a few lines, example of everything that was kind of happening at this time, right?
Mm-mm-mm. Yeah.
So so the three witches featured in this slide, these are actually three noble women, like so it's actually like portraiture, which I love this picture of the three witches of Macbeth. So Shakespeare's three witches in Macbeth are actually based on an earlier play. A lot of, I mean, if we had a Shakespeare scholar here, they could walk us through how he did this a lot.
Romeo and Juliet's thousands of years old.
Right?
Yeah.
So like he didn't come up with original stories, much like I think like how we see like Homer in the Iliad, and like they weren't original stories. They didn't come up with the ideas. They just communicated in a way that really resonated with people.
Yeah.
So this earlier play by Matthew Gwynne is very sorry, called The Three Sibyls. That's where Shakespeare got the idea from Macbeth and the Three Witches from. But what we see what's happened in between this earlier play, we see the witch hunts happening. We see this real need for anyone who is not adhering to strict Christian dogma, for them to be othered and pilloried. So he doesn't call them the Sibyls, he calls them the witches.
Mm-mm-mm.
So it's like this is an example of how the Sibyl on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel as this elevated figure, she is finally severed from like living Sibyls, and living Sibyls become known as witches. Really, like that is where the witch, we enter that point where this has been building for centuries, but there's that tipping point that happens here, that any prophecy that was outside of kind of the confines of the church, any healing or herbalism, that kind of work, and we get into like the burning times, right? Like we get into this very, very dark period in the history of humanity, where the church and the Inquisitions and all of this business, when that Sibyl is finally completely separated from the very earthly living incarnations of that archetype.
Yeah.
And we wanted to kind of like segue into a topic that is related to this business of what kind of happens in that period in the 16th and 17th century. It seems a little bit unrelated, but it actually is. But we're also kind of flipping the history dial back to the time of Delphi, in that. So this is from an article by Esther Igno, and I love this article. You can find it on Google Scholar. So it's called Oracles and Oracle Sellers, an Ancient Market in Futures. I love the play on words there, right? Because they were predicting the futures, but also it's very like commodified. And this is something that has always been part of, I guess, being a Sibyl, whether we call it a modern psychic or a tarot reader today, or whatever word we're using to describe someone who does this kind of divinatory work as a profession. It's this complicated association between the spiritual and the capitalistic, right, and the need to earn an income in society. And the point she makes about what was going on in Delphi was that, they were markets and futures. I really like this whole idea
I like it
that,
too.
right, that having the Sibyl, the different Sibyls, like whether at Delphi or Cumae or elsewhere, like their predictions were kind of like the modern stock market predictions, right? Like when the bank, we say like the Bank of Canada is going to change the interest rate, like, that was the kind of influence that their oracles would have had. Everything would have changed in a society, right? It would have been a big deal. Like, if someone says like the inflation, we're living in an age of inflation, right? So it's like for us, like when we hear inflation is increased again, like that's like a modern oracle because it literally causes everything to change.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that what the Pythia would have been saying, like it had this kind of effect, like if the US Treasury Secretary comes out and says something, everyone is like, we're listening.
I
Um,
love this. You're right.
right?
Yeah. I love this. Yeah. This correlation. Yeah.
Like, so we're listening and we're going to change, things are going to change because of what they said. And it's really complicated. Like, just like today, like when the US Treasury or the Bank of Canada or I don't know what goes on. Is it like a European Union version of this?
The IMF,
Okay,
the
the
International
IMF,
Monetary
when
Fund.
they
Yeah.
do these things and say we're going to raise interest rates or here's what inflation is,
Yeah.
that's a big, complicated, institutionalized thing. But they are making predictions.
Yeah.
It's not a surefire bet that these things are going to happen,
Yeah.
and we tend to discount that. And I think like in what we've learned about the ancient Sibyls, like it was the same kind of thing. They were making a prediction. And there is something very kind of mystical, if you ask me, about predicting like monetary futures, just the whole way money works
Yeah.
has this
Definitely.
mystical undercurrent, right? That we've all been asked to believe in. And I think so if we think of like the modern approach to money as being kind of a parallel to how the Sibyls would have influenced things, that it's really like when they spoke, it was widespread, it was adapted, it shifted things.
Yeah, yeah. I love what you're saying because it's reminding me of something that the economist philosopher Social Touche says. Like so to start with, like obviously in most of these times that we're referring to, there did not really exist an economy as we understand it today. Like the economy is really how we're sort of like defining the pulse of anything in relation to our communities, which is part of what makes what you're saying so potent, right? But the case that Social Touche makes is that we sort of replaced like sort of the organizing aspects of religion with the economy, and even like defining what an economy is really difficult to do because it's so vague, and its underpinnings in reality are so fragile. But at some point he also talks about how like these sorts of like exchanges that you make in spirit of like of faith, of love, of energy, of effort, they're the same kinds of exchanges that you make in an economy. Like an economy is working on the same sorts of like spiritual transactions, but they've been sort of like desacralized, right? Like we've done something a bit horrible, like particularly to money, right? Like paleo money, for example, was not something that you could just like acquire and then use to like leverage over another people. Like we've done something really strange with the structure that we've designed, which kind of like which impacts, yeah, the work of oracles and whose futures are considered legitimate futures, but also like what happened to these oracles that we're talking about now, which kind of like leads to our next topic.
Yeah. So one other note from this paper, I highly recommend it. It's so well written and really interesting, and it presents ideas that I'd never thought about before.
Yeah.
So she bases this in the idea there's I guess in this her field of scholarly inquiry, there's this idea that like Delphi and Cumae, they competed against each other, like in trying to get, like because they were marketplaces around them, like people would come there. It was big business. It was tourism
Yeah.
as well, right?
Yeah.
Um, and it's like going to Lord or something. like, so there was all this business associated with it, and that they always competed, and it was this kind of like our modern take, like, that businesses are pitted against each other.
Yeah.
And when she went back and re-examined like the existing data, she said that she finds more of a model of cooperation, that they supported each other,
Yeah.
and that they traded like seers back and forth. So if you can imagine, like, I don't know, like Apple and Google being like, yeah, I've got too many employees and you need some over there, so we're just going to trade them back and forth. That's what the evidence actually says, which I find really interesting.
I like this. I like this a lot.
Yeah, it's one of those kind of like sidebars. It's not really central to our thesis, but it's this idea that even like when we look at how these temples would have interacted with each other, we do that thing where we have that capitalistic competitive lens
Yeah.
that we slap on stuff, right?
True, it's true. And in fact, like what you're describing, that's actually how the Dutch advertising industry works. Like, like it's very collaborative, like they're always sharing information. They share a lot of creatives. Maybe a Dutch person will speak differently. But for example, like the big advertising conference where I just was, like, like all of the brands, they compete to throw these big parties. And the Dutch do theirs together. They call it the Dutch Embassy of Creativity, and all of like the Dutch, yeah, and it's really cute, and they give away like bottled waters because they worry about like, people like, like not having reusable bottles, things like this. So they're really interested in this sort of collaborative social cohesion that's really rare in the advertising industry at large. And it's a model that works.
That's really interesting.
Mm.
So I think part of like we do a lot about like re-examining like how the feminine was represented like 2000 years ago up to today. But I think there's also that generally like this idea that the feminine is more collaborative,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
about competing with, not competing against,
Yes,
right?
exactly. Exactly. Like very feminine principle stuff, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. But
Okay,
like
what have you got for us?
so this is totally related to what you're talking about. I love this book. It's called Caliban and the Witch. And it's basically about capitalism. So the case that Silvia Federici is making is that, like we have this idea that capitalism was this natural offshoot of feudalism. I'm not going to go into all the details, but the case that she essentially makes is that in the early days of capitalism, when feudalism was sort of coming apart, what capitalism had to do and what it needs to continuously do is basically loot. It's a process called primitive accumulation. Like it steals land, it disenfranchises people, etc. And so one of the things that it contributed to doing in the Middle Ages specifically was disenfranchising women. And one of the reasons why this was important was because it would encourage merchants to work outside longer because women were just stuck at home, like they were pulled from their jobs, and like rape was also legalized, so there was a lot less incentive to go outside. And also because women kind of lost the ability, like they had a lot of functions, but they lost the ability to do anything else legitimate for the culture besides like be at home and have children. Their children were also, they could be easily expropriated for the market again. And so one of like, it's a very long thesis, it's a very compelling thesis, but one of the things that happens in this process is specifically like what leads to the witch hunts. So you see like, like Shakespeare sort of turning Sibyls into witches. This is very much part of this. Prophecy becomes a really big problem. It's very much in the realm of women, and it's something that you just can't stop people from doing, especially people in the lower and poor classes, which were extremely hard to control. And in the early days of capitalism, this becomes a really big deal. I think it says something here like, yeah, from a capitalist viewpoint, the future can be anticipated only insofar as the regularity and immutability of the system is assumed. That is like only insofar as it assumed that the future will be like the past. Basically, we start talking about things like calculation of probabilities, which is really different from a wider sense of a more sort of like spectral constellational future. This was a really big thing to sort of get a handle on, because no matter how much you push down on lower classes, if they had this sort of like power of prophecy that was coming straight from them, it could justify any action that they might take. It suddenly gave them this weapon that was outside of the market, and that made them really dangerous. And again, like to return to like Cindy's point about like how, like the future became ideas of futures. Like this is where that begins to happen. Like, you don't want to have oracular power anymore. You want to be talking about market probabilities instead. And like, what does the Fed say? Not like, I don't know, what does Madame Cleo say? So you get the sort of like delegitimization of a specific type of prophecy in favor of one that's specifically in favor of market effects only.
That's so good. And the other thing is that, like you said, like they're like the brujas and all of the folk healers in communities that provided like accessible prophecy,
Yeah.
as part of like their healing services, like that's impossible to stop in the lower classes. And the other thing is like the language of futures is like most of us don't even understand like what the hell the Fed is talking about. Even though like we might have a mortgage and have personal debt or student loans, and it's actually important for us to
Yeah, it's super
understand,
important. Yeah.
but we don't understand it because they never come out and say what it actually is.
Yeah, exactly. And it's
Yeah,
also like extremely whimsical,
it is
like they
extremely
don't really
whimsical.
know.
Like maybe they sit on ethylene faults when they look with all of their computers.
We'll know hundreds of years from now when they let us in, like
But
when they let us in those buildings.
it says a lot, but it's not actually helpful. Like
Yeah,
like they
exactly.
never say you should really buckle down on spending. They'll say inflation is going up 3%. It's like instead of just saying like talk about Sibylline, like
Yeah,
in
exactly.
uttering nonsense, like what does that even mean to like how is
Yeah,
that helpful? So,
yeah,
versus like folk healers who are Sibyls who often give you very practical advice. Don't
yeah.
marry her, don't take that job. You know what I mean? Like, meanwhile, the government is giving us this kind of stuff that is like not helpful.
Yeah, or like during the W Bush era, like the most common thing that you would hear him say is that like like the best thing you can do to help the country is like just go shopping, just keep going shopping. Debt is money, like, and it was just like it's terrible advice. It's horrible advice.
Absolutely horrible advice. But again, based on like these statistical models of capitalism that don't take into effect something beyond this like mythical economy. But I
Yeah.
really do think centuries from now they will think we worshipped something called the economy.
Certainly, yeah. Like people already do think that. Touche already thinks that, like it's like it's very visceral. And this extra detail here was just like a fun thing that I wanted to toss in because it relates to now. As I mentioned, like sort of controlling women's reproduction became really important during that time. So in addition to banning things like prophecy, etc., they also wanted to ban things like midwifery and herb lore. Like midwifery has kind of this like occult vibe for us now, but midwifery was functionally general medicine.
Mm.
Like if you could take care of like a women's bodies, miscarriages, babies arriving, babies not arriving properly, you were probably taking care of the general medicine of everybody. Like that was kind of like the basis of what you had to know, and a lot of that was related to really old herb lore. And so this is also the moment when things like contraceptives and abortifacients become considered maleficium,
Mm.
because they also take away from the sort of like a market control. It actually says something, yeah, like the uterus reduced to a machine for the reproduction of labor. So this is transferred directly into the hands of the state and the medical profession. And as Federici sort of argues in her book, which is like it's been a few years since it was published, she was like, you can still see that happening. It happens over and over. Capitalism has to do it again and again. And yeah, like I don't think that I have to like point to where that's happening
But
again.
it's so pressing on us like right now, like this
Yeah,
summer. It's wild that, like you said, capitalism has to push back
yeah,
and make sure that there are new workers produced for these low-paying jobs.
Yeah, yeah.
So
It
it's
becomes
like
really,
capitalism, in this way of thinking, capitalism, has several goals that are kind of directly related to what we might call lunar or feminine, which would
mm-mm-mm.
be like midwifery as, that kind of general practice about, managing contraception um, and conception and pregnancy and birth and taking care of children, that chorotrophic, which is a term from ancient Greek, that chorotrophic kind of capacity, which is also really connected to prophecy and the Sibyls and so on. Like, so all of these things, capitalism needs to periodically, according to Federici,
Mm-mm.
periodically do a purge and just remind when these things get too powerful, it has to push back. And
Yeah,
so it's not like, our systems of religion are so entwined with capitalism that they can't really be parsed out.
no.
And so people will think, oh, this is a religious matter. But actually, no, it's an economical matter.
Usually so. Yeah, yeah. It's a real problem in systems theory. There's a wonderful book called The Limits to Growth that kind of looks at, like the fact that like we have a model that is only growing all the time, like it facilitates more growth. So it facilitates population growth, which facilitates more consumption and then more waste. And then how do you solve it? And so one of the common beliefs is that like capitalism kind of like trickles down wealth and education, and then this problem is kind of magically solved, like this problem of like exploding population, etc. But the authors actually make the case that the only universal thing actually that makes a difference anywhere is whether women can control their bodies and manage their futures and have access to safe work. Like it's literally the only thing. So this kind of like war in the public space about like who controls women's bodies is super political and really tied into these topics of like imperialism and capitalism and the patriarchy. You can't really separate these things, which is also part of what makes like the idea of the witch so political, and how we define magic, for example.
It's so true.
Mm-mm.
We've come a long way from 3,000 years ago. We are almost to so we are in the late 19th century, and we couldn't conclude this talk about the Sibyl without talking about the spiritualist movement. And I
Yeah.
think this really brings the whole thing about how what is Sibyllic or the witch, how that is politicized and connected to women's control over their own bodies and own destinies, like how this is all packaged up. So I'm just going to there's lots of sources on this. I just grabbed Waking the Witch by Pam Grossman, which is a great book. If you
I
haven't
love
read it, you
her.
should.
Yeah. Hmm.
In it, she talks about spiritualists. So, kind of in this container we've built about how from ancient times the Sibyls were associated with the economy, whatever it was at the time, because they either generated revenue, helped people generated revenue, got revenue themselves, and how the women's ability to be like in charge of their own lives in terms of like contraception, and they were being called witches, and how any kind of Sibyllic Sibylline prophecy came from the state and had nothing really to do with what is truly oracular or intuitive or mystical. So how this rose, and there really was this intersection of all of these things with the rise of spiritualism. And the really interesting thing about spiritualism is that it allowed Victorian era women to earn a good living, to get some prominence in society, even get a little bit of attention and a little bit of notoriety and celebrity. That this was even during these days, like for a woman to author a novel was considered outlandish, right?
Mm-mm.
So these women, these audacious women, were doing um, like prophetic readings, but talking to dead spirits as opposed to the gods. Because so we don't talk to God anymore. We've given up on that, perhaps, because that hasn't worked out great for us. But now we found like a safer outlet where we can talk to the spirits of our departed loved ones. how can that be wrong, right? But of course it was wrong. And one of the really interesting things is that, I mean, obviously some of these women were fakes. The picture in the middle, that's probably, who knows if the woman had set that up to look fake, or if the newspapers did that afterwards, because there's lots of that tomfoolery that went on, right? Is to make them look like fakes. So there was this wide acceptance that spiritualism was a load of crap, and that it was all fakes, and they were doing all of this stuff. But now that there's a re-examination of a lot of this, that it's to say, who knows what was really going on, because there was a movement by the powerful in society to push back against how popular these women were in society. So it's like when the Sibyl, tries to break out of what society expects of her, like there was a lot of pushback, and that hasn't changed, right? I wanted also to give this shout out to this book called Strange Rites by Tara Isabella Burton, because we wanted to conclude this by talking about like the road from Delphi to today. We've woven through all of this history. And one thing that's really an invention in North America in particular is like the importance of the individual, like the individual, like kind of that Ayn Rand ideology that is so entrenched here in North America, that everything is personal, everything is about like we can control our own outcomes, we can control our own fate. So whatever we do is up to us, and that the separation of state and church, of course. So, but this, like she points out, it's a very novel idea. The way we have this separation of church and state, and the way we think like it's up to an individual, like whatever religion you have or don't have, it's up to you. It's not up to the state to kind of, the state doesn't do this. The state doesn't dictate this in North America. I mean, we can argue that, like social norms are like an arm of the state, but, that's a more complicated thing. But so there's this whole thing that we need to take into account, that we are a very individualized society, which I find really interesting, because when you loop all the way back to the ancient Sibyls, it was a very different society.
Yeah.
Right. Where it was like religion was like economy is today. It's like, who runs it? I don't know. What does it mean? Beats me. It was part of life in a way that was very difficult to articulate it. And then I think that is really why we're going to just pull out a couple of things to end the talk with, why this archetype of the Sibyl, our human need to understand ourselves better and predict the future, how that, and that our lack of this kind of formal role in religion, and that most of us don't give any credence to religion anymore, organized religion, that all of this has kind of created this situation where we turn to individual mystical methods for divination, whether going to like an individual like service provider or doing it ourselves. We have a DIY approach to being the Sibyl these days, right? Like we're in charge of it. The state has nothing to do with it. Well, except that I would argue the economy is very, like, it's kind of the same thing for our time. So psychic services, the psychic industry is huge. These are US statistics. It's like, this is in hundreds of millions of dollars estimated. So this is what's reported in, I think, for tax returns. So like, obviously, if you've ever been involved in the psychic world, there's a lot of like informal or casual economy that goes on. So there's billions of dollars. Like, this is a huge industry. We still seek the Sibyl. She's just very different for us today. She's not an agent of the state. And then just the rise in popularity of tarot and oracle cards, and astrology apps. Like, this need to understand ourselves better and to predict what might happen in a more spiritual sense, like it is more popular now than ever, even though at the state level, and even if you're like a part of organized religion, this is still kind of shunned as wrong. And we have a great example of where this all comes to a very fascinating nexus.
Love this. Joan Quigley.
Joan Quigley. No discussion on bringing the Sibyls into the modern era would be completed without Joan Quigley. So, in searching for examples of like, is there any world, like government in the world, like kind of like one of the big powers of the world that actually does anything other than the economic kind of Sibyllic stuff that, well, that we're saying is Sibyllic in a sense? Is there anyone who actually employs a Sibyl? And the ultra conservative US President Ronald Reagan um, actually had a Sibyl. He had an astrologer named Joan Quigley who like influenced a lot of things he did, but officially she was only in charge of his schedule. She used astrology, and I know some people in astrology will say it's not divinatory, it's science. That's fine, you do you. For me, astrology is both. That there is a prophetic aspect to electional astrology and predictive astrology, right? If you're predicting best dates, there's something more to it than just what's going on in the heavens.
Yeah.
So he had Joan Quigley there doing like, what does it say in this excerpt? So Reagan kept a color-coded calendar on his desk with good days highlighted in green and bad days highlighted in red. So if you Google Joan Quigley, you'll find lots and lots on her. She's a fascinating character. But the good days and the bad days, it's just like having the bay leaves, right? Like the different, like the messages on your. It's so interesting.
And I just love how Sibylline she looks.
Right?
She
looks like maybe she sat on some ethylene faults in her life. This is a pop culture reference from when I was a kid. This was a TV show miniseries starring Sally Field. I wanted to like highlight this. If you can find it, watch it. It's really cool. But in this character, Sibyl, played by Sally Field, she's, I think, a school teacher, and she has what was called then multiple personalities. We would call it dissociative identity. And for me, like, it links back to the Sibyl, she speaks for 1,000 tongues. Like, you know what I mean? It's like all of those personalities, all of the voices inside of her, and that this is like, and when the character Sibyl unifies herself with all of these different pieces of her, then she finds healing and wholeness. And then I think that's a real takeaway message. Like, for those of us who have this aspect of ourselves that we do, like that we do know what's going on in the next room without being there. Or, we can make inferences about what's likely to happen in a way that's very intuitive that like other people might not be able to do. Like putting 2 and 2 together and coming up with 17. And someone is like, well, how did you do that? And it's like, well, there's all of these other things to take into consideration. And 17 is actually the right answer in this case, not 4. So, there's that whole kind of energy around like what is the Sibyl is about unifying all of those pieces of ourselves. And since I teach a lot of the principles of internal family systems therapy, I wanted just to kind of close with that idea that so if you are a book you can read about IFS is called No Bad Parts by Richard Schwartz. And the aspects of IFS where we are talking to all of our different selves has like that oracular mystical aspect to it. Like, it's not cognitive behavioral therapy. Like, it's about that there are all these voices within us that we can communicate with. So I wanted to end up with that. And we're just going to close by paying homage to the very Sibylline Margaret Atwood. You have to. Although she is certainly not a religious figure, she represents like how the artist in society is often very Sibylline, Sibyllic, right? Like they know they are connected to what is going on already, and that gives, and they know where they've come from, they know their history, and they know what's going on now, they are aware, and that allows them almost like a crystal ball that they can see clearly what is most likely to happen.
Yeah, yeah, they can pull from all these disparate threads and weave something of what we're going to see next. I love this.
And I would say that is where that's the liminal, that's the mystical. I mean, that's the Hecate spirit in things, right? It's that weaving together of all of these things to see what may come. So thank you so much for hanging out with us while we did this deep dive.
Thank you, everyone.
It has been great fun, as always, and we'll see you next month.
Take care.